July 30th, 1944. Normandy, France. Dawn is still a rumor on the horizon. The hedgerows breathe mist, thick as smoke, rolling low across the fields. Somewhere beneath that shroud, a Sherman tank crouches in silence. Steel lungs holding their breath. Inside, 5 men wait. The air smells of oil, sweat, and iron. Their world is dim red light and quiet heartbeats. At the commander's hatch, Lieutenant Frank Daws, 25, son of a Cleveland mechanic, peers through a strange contraption. A periscope turned upside down. Its crooked brass joints and salvaged glass had earned only laughter a week ago. Frank's backward spyglass, they'd called it. A gimmick. A joke. But now, no one is laughing. Through that reversed lens, Frank sees movement. Something massive, deliberate, sliding through the fog. A panther. German steel. Patient and perfect. Its long gun sweeps the hedgerow like a blind finger searching for death. Frank whispers, "Hold steady." His voice barely exists. He adjusts the cracked mirror, sighting through the impossible angle, the world inverted, the danger upright. The others grip their stations, waiting for his word. In a war of armor and fire, it's not the strongest who live, but the one who learns to see first. By the summer of 1944, the war in Europe had entered its bloodiest equation. The Allies had stormed the beaches of Normandy in June, and for weeks since, the countryside had been transformed into a maze of mud, smoke, and shattered towns. To the generals, Normandy was a chessboard. To the men inside the tanks, it was a trap. The land itself fought back. Every field was boxed in by bocage, tall earthen embankments tangled with ancient hedgerows that turned each patch of farmland into a fortress. To infantry, it was suffocating. To tank crews, it was lethal. A Sherman could barely climb over those walls without exposing its soft belly to German guns. And waiting behind many of those hedgerows were the Panthers, sleek, deadly predators of German engineering. They were faster than they looked, harder than anything the Allies could field, and armed with a 75 mm Call 42 L-70 gun that could pierce a Sherman from over a kilometer away. The Sherman, the Allies' workhorse, was everything the Panther wasn't. Light, mass-produced and easy to maintain. It was the tank that could be shipped, repaired, and replaced faster than any other machine on the battlefield. But inside that speed and simplicity was a quiet truth. The Sherman was outgunned, under-armored, and terrifying to crew. The soldiers knew it. They gave it grim nicknames, Tommy Cooker, Ronson, because, they joked, it lights every time. For Allied crews in Normandy, survival wasn't about strength. It was about seeing first. Whoever spotted the other first usually lived long enough to shoot. Whoever hesitated, burned. But seeing in Normandy was almost impossible. The hedgerows blocked every line of sight. Commanders couldn't raise their heads without risking a sniper's bullet. The periscopes, designed for open fields, were useless here. They were too low, too fixed, too limited. It was a battlefield where the enemy could be 50 yards away and invisible. Lieutenant Frank Daws knew this truth better than most. His tank, call sign Ghost Baker, had lost friends to invisible fire. He'd seen Shermans erupt without warning, seen men crawl out burning and silent. It wasn't lack of courage that killed them. It was blindness. He began to think of ways to change that. Not with new weapons or armor, but with vision. The U.S. Army didn't train soldiers to invent. It trained them to follow procedure. But Daws wasn't built that way. Raised in a Cleveland garage, he'd grown up with grease under his fingernails and curiosity wired into his hands. Rules didn't matter if they didn't work. One evening, while scavenging near a wrecked German outpost, he found a cracked optical scope, half buried in mud, part of a damaged rangefinder from a Panther. The glass was chipped, but the mechanism still worked. Daws studied it, turning it over in his palm. And that's when the idea took shape. If the periscope couldn't look high enough from inside the tank, maybe it didn't need to. Maybe it could look differently. He mounted the salvaged lens backward, reversed its internal prism, and attached it to the Sherman's commander hatch, with brackets scavenged from a jeep. It looked absurd, like a plumbing accident bolted to steel. But when he peered through it, he saw something no one else could. A clear, upright field beyond the hedgerow, flipped, distorted, but visible. For the first time, a Sherman could see over the wall without exposing itself. His crew didn't understand it. They laughed, teased, questioned, but Daws didn't argue. He just kept adjusting, polishing, calibrating. Because in the bocage, ideas were more valuable than orders. And soon, this strange contraption, this upside-down periscope, would face its first test. It wouldn't be in a workshop or training ground. It would be in the middle of Normandy, when a panther crept too close, and 5 men inside a steel box would bet their lives on the invention everyone thought was a joke. The fields of Normandy were about to become a laboratory for survival. And for Lieutenant Frank Daws, failure wasn't an option. By mid-July 1944, the push inland from the beaches had slowed to a crawl. The Allied advance, so decisive on D-Day, now ground forward yard by yard, field by field. Every crossroads was contested. Every hedgerow hid something deadly. The Panther was the shadow over all of it, the fear that haunted every radio call. To the men on the ground, it wasn't just a tank. It was an executioner that struck unseen and disappeared behind smoke. American doctrine offered simple advice. Avoid them. Flank them if you can. Call air support if you can't. But inside the maze of Normandy, airstrikes rarely found their mark, and flanking was a fantasy. The bocage made movement unpredictable and fatal. Frank Daws refused to accept that. He had always been the kind of man who took problems personally. His crew knew it too well. They called him the Professor, part joke, part respect. Where others smoked or wrote letters during downtime, Frank disassembled machine parts, cleaned optics, studied manuals by the dim glow of a lantern. When he started tinkering with that broken German rangefinder, they thought he was just killing time. But in truth, he was trying to kill fear. The Sherman's periscope, the M4 type, gave the commander a limited forward view, maybe 15 degrees at best. But in the hedgerows, that view ended at dirt. To spot enemy armor, a man had to stick his head out of the hatch. Frank had seen too many die that way. His idea was simple and radical. Flip the periscope upside down. Reverse the optics. Let it see up and over instead of straight ahead. It would distort the image, flip it vertically, but the brain could adapt. It wasn't perfect, but it worked. He spent nights fine-tuning it, bolting it to a swivel mount, testing it against the horizon. It wobbled at first. Vibrations blurred the image when the engine idled. He reinforced it with a rubber gasket from a fuel line and bolts scavenged from a wrecked Jeep. It wasn't elegant. It was survival. When he showed it to his commanding officer, the response was predictable. "You're not here to build gadgets, Lieutenant," the captain said flatly. "Stick to the manual." Frank nodded, saluted, and went back to work. Within a week, the periscope was part of Ghost Baker's routine. The crew still joked about it, calling it Frank's kaleidoscope, but their tone had softened. They'd seen what he saw through that glass: the horizon, the tree line, the faint reflection of German armor glinting in the distance. Then came the new orders. A reconnaissance sweep near Saint-Fromond, where German counterattacks had been reported. 2 Panthers had been sighted moving along the route départementale 225, possibly hunting for supply convoys. Frank's platoon was tasked to intercept. They moved at dusk. No headlights, no chatter, just the slow rumble of steel through the fog. Frank chose their position carefully. A shallow depression beneath twin hedgerows, overlooking a narrow lane lined with oaks. The air was heavy with smoke from artillery further south. The ground trembled faintly with distant gunfire. They cut the engine. Silence fell. Inside the Sherman they waited. 5 men sharing the same cramped heartbeat. Hours passed. The mist thickened. The periscope fogged and cleared again. Then, faintly, Frank heard it. The deep, rhythmic thrum of a Maybach engine. The sound of a panther, close and confident. He leaned into the periscope, adjusting its crude brackets. The image shimmered and inverted, but he could make out the movement. A shadow gliding behind the orchard line, massive and deliberate. The thing everyone feared most was right there, and it had no idea they were watching. Frank didn't speak. He didn't breathe. He just whispered into the intercom, "Hold steady." The rest of the crew froze. The gunner gripped the traverse. The loader steadied a 75mm armor-piercing shell in trembling hands. The driver turned off the ignition. In that moment, every hour of laughter, every word of doubt vanished. The upside-down periscope, the joke, the oddity, the forbidden experiment, was about to be tested in the only way that mattered. In silence, under pressure, against death itself. The night thickened, and through the reversed glass, Frank Daws watched the Panther emerge. War isn't just fought between armies, it's fought between heartbeats. Inside a Sherman tank, there was no such thing as comfort, only routine, ritual, and noise. The men of Ghostbaker knew every creak of their machine. They could tell which gear was grinding, which track was slipping, just by feel. They lived pressed shoulder to shoulder in a space smaller than a delivery van, surrounded by heat, fumes, and fear. For Lieutenant Frank Daws and his crew, Joe Harrison, driver, Sam Doc Miller, gunner, Ralph Tiny Gibson, loader, and Corporal Ellis, radio operator. The tank wasn't just metal. It was their coffin, their shield, and their home. They'd been through ambushes before. They'd seen Shermans burn. The memory never left them. You could smell it long before you saw it. The stench of scorched rubber, hot oil, and something else. Something human. Every man who climbed back into a tank after that carried a quiet kind of courage. The courage to seal himself inside and trust the others completely. That trust was everything. One man's panic could kill them all. That's why Dawes' strange invention unsettled them. It wasn't that they didn't respect him. They did. But tanks ran on procedure, not creativity. Anything new felt dangerous. You don't test theories in battle, Tiny once said. You test luck. And yet, in the stillness of Normandy, as they crouched beneath those hedgerows, fear turned into focus. The periscope they once mocked became a lifeline. Frank's calm, steady voice over the intercom carried something rare. Confidence. He wasn't guessing. He was seeing. In war, belief spreads faster than fire. If one man stays calm, the others follow. That was Frank's gift. He made the impossible seem logical. Even in a world that no longer made sense. A tank's greatest weapon isn't its gun, it's its vision. In 1944, that truth was painfully clear. German tanks, the Panther, the Tiger, even the older Mark IVs, were equipped with Zeiss optics, precision-crafted instruments that gave their gunners incredible range and clarity. Through those lenses, German crews could spot a Sherman before it even reached effective range. The Sherman, by contrast, was designed to be built by the tens of thousands. Its vision systems were rugged, reliable, and replaceable, but crude. The M6 periscope gave a limited forward view. The commander's cupola sight offered even less. Most of the time, visibility meant risk. If you wanted to truly see, you had to expose your head. And in the bocage, exposure meant death. Dawes's upside-down periscope was, in essence, a rebellion against those limitations. By reversing the optical path, he created a defilade viewing system, a way to look above cover without exposing the turret or his head. The image was inverted, yes, but the advantage was revolutionary. Unseen observation. It was an accident of geometry turned into a survival tool. This simple shift, flipping a lens, trusting the distortion, anticipated something future generations of engineers would refine into advanced indirect vision systems. But Daws didn't know that. He only knew that seeing first could mean living longer. Through his reversed optics, he could scan the horizon beyond the hedgerow, fields, roads, tree lines, all while his tank remained invisible. In a place where visibility defined life and death, that small field of view became priceless. He didn't have the luxury of waiting for a better design. He had to make one. And like so many soldiers on that front, necessity became invention. Across the line, the German Panther was both a marvel and a myth. Engineers called it the Panzerkampfwagen 5. Soldiers simply called it the nightmare. It was born from lessons learned on the Eastern Front, when Soviet T-34s stunned the Wehrmacht with their mobility and sloped armor. The Panther was Germany's answer, faster, deadlier, and almost indestructible from the front. It weighed nearly 45 tons. Its armor sloped elegantly to deflect shells. Its KWK-42 75mm gun could shred a Sherman long before the Americans could even aim. Its optics, crafted by Zeiss, were the envy of the world. To the German crews, the Panther wasn't just a weapon. It was an identity, proof of German engineering supremacy. They felt untouchable. Many advanced casually, confident that no Sherman could outshoot or outthink them. But perfection breeds overconfidence. The Panther's greatest flaw wasn't in its armor or its gun. It was in its assumptions. Its crews believed the enemy could never see them first. They relied on intimidation, on dominance. So when that morning came, when one Panther rolled through the fog near Saint-Fromond, its commander wasn't cautious. He scanned the tree line through his perfect optics and saw nothing. No glint of glass, no silhouette. The fields seemed empty. What he couldn't know was that 50 yards away, a man with a cracked lens and an upside-down periscope was already watching him. The Panther was everything the Germans believed in: precision, order, power. The Sherman was everything the Americans had to become: adaptable, improvised human. That morning, the two philosophies were about to meet. Not in theory, but in smoke and fire. The fear, the technology, and the arrogance, three forces colliding in one corner of Normandy. The stage was set. The predator was in motion, and in the shadow of the hedgerows, Lieutenant Frank Daws waited to prove that even in a war of machines, the human mind was still the deadliest weapon of all. The Normandy bocage was not a battlefield. It was a labyrinth. 4 foot, walls of earth and centuries-old hedgerows divided the countryside into thousands of small enclosures. Visibility was measured not in miles, but in meters. For armored warfare, it was hell. Tanks designed for open plains were now fighting in a green maze where every corner could hide a gun barrel. The Germans had turned this terrain into a weapon, setting traps, digging in, and firing from positions so well concealed that even the sound of a shot came too late. The American response was desperation turned to ingenuity. Tankers began to think like hunters, not drivers. They learned to move silently, using infantry scouts to lead them. Some units cut small slits in the hedgerows, just wide enough for their guns to fire through. Others welded improvised blades, Cullen hedgerow cutters, to slice through the earthen walls instead of climbing them. But Frank Daws approached the problem differently. He realized that the real danger wasn't movement. It was blindness. If he could see over the hedge without showing the tank, he could choose when and where to strike. The upside-down periscope was more than a gadget. It was a new tactic. On paper, it defied logic. A reversed image, a warped horizon, a disorienting field of view. But in Frank's hands, it was precision. He had turned the tank into a silent observer. His crew could lie in wait, hidden under the canopy of branches, while he watched the road ahead like a sniper through glass. It was the same principle that submarines had used for decades, but now applied to armored warfare. The Germans expected noisy, aggressive American movements. What they got instead was patience. And patience, in the bocage, was lethal. Frank's plan was simple. Let the Panther come to them. Ambush from concealment. See first, shoot first. End the myth. War is built on rules, and rules keep armies alive. But sometimes, survival demands disobedience. Most officers in Normandy didn't want inventors in their ranks. Innovation slowed procedure, and procedure kept units predictable. Predictability was safety. Yet by the summer of 1944, predictability had also become a death sentence. The U.S. command was beginning to learn that the battlefield was evolving, faster than any manual could keep up. General Omar Bradley himself once remarked that the enemy teaches us faster than the textbooks. Across the front, American soldiers were quietly rewriting those textbooks, welding armor plates, improvising communications, turning field repairs into battlefield revolutions. Frank Dawes's upside-down periscope was part of that quiet rebellion, an invention born without permission, tested without oversight, proven without orders. His immediate superior had called it nonsense, but when word of the Panther kill spread later, that same officer sent for Daws to explain it. That was the paradox of leadership in war, the thin line between defiance and genius. Some leaders punished improvisation. Others learned to embrace it. The most effective commanders, the ones who lived long enough to adapt, realized that every rule has an expiration date once the shooting starts. Daws never set out to make a statement. He simply refused to die by someone else's doctrine. His kind of leadership wasn't loud or glorious. It was quiet, pragmatic, and born from an unshakable truth. No order mattered more than keeping his men alive. His men trusted him because he never asked them to risk what he wouldn't. And when he told them that this odd-looking periscope would keep them alive, they believed, not in the device, but in him. War crushes originality. It rewards obedience. And yet, every major advance in warfare, from radar to camouflage, began with someone being laughed at. Frank Daws embodied that contradiction. He wasn't a scientist. He wasn't a decorated hero. He was a soldier who believed that thinking differently could be a survival skill. When he first flipped that lens, he didn't imagine legacy or credit. He just wanted to see the battlefield before the battlefield saw him. That was the morality of the front line. Innovation wasn't about pride. It was about staying alive. Still, it takes courage to be mocked in a world where conformity means safety. His own crew doubted him. Other units called his invention Frank's toy. Even his superior officers dismissed it. But none of them were there when a Panther shell tore through a nearby Sherman days earlier, leaving nothing but fire. The ridicule stopped meaning anything. Courage in war isn't always about charging forward. Sometimes it's about refusing to step back from an idea when the world tells you to. When Frank leaned into that periscope on the morning of July 30, 1944, He wasn't thinking about honor or recognition. He was thinking about his crew, men who trusted him enough to wait for his word. And that trust, that shared defiance against fear, is what makes soldiers something more than survivors. The laughter had faded. The waiting was over. The field was quiet again, until it wasn't. Through the mist and the cracked lens, Frank Daws could see movement. The Panther had arrived, and now, for the first time, the invention everyone mocked was about to stare straight into the eyes of death, and not blink. The moment had come. The man, the machine, and the idea, all converging in one impossible chance to prove that invention could beat perfection. July 30th, 1944, near Saint-Fromond, Normandy. The mist clung low to the hedgerows like breath on glass. The sun had not yet broken the horizon, but the world was already awake. Engines murmuring far off, artillery muttering beyond the hills. Inside Ghostbaker, the air was tense and heavy. The crew had been waiting in silence for nearly an hour, each man listening to his own heartbeat echo against the hull. Then it came. The sound they all feared and recognized at once. The deep, mechanical growl of a panther. It wasn't loud, but it carried that rolling pulse of German steel. Lieutenant Frank Daws leaned into his upside-down periscope, his cheek brushing the cold rim of the metal mount. Through the reversed optics, the world was warped and inverted. But movement was clear. A massive silhouette sliding between trees, cautious, deliberate. "Target's close," he whispered into the intercom. No one answered. The gunner, Sam "Doc" Miller, steadied his hands on the traverse wheel. Tiny, the loader, held a 75mm armor-piercing round like it was sacred. Joe, the driver, shut off the ignition. The tank went still, a heartbeat in a field of ghosts. Outside, the Panther advanced slowly, its commander half exposed in the turret cupola, binoculars scanning. He was confident. Why wouldn't he be? He'd killed Shermans before. Through the flipped lens, Frank watched the German tank glide into view. Its gun was moving, searching the hedgerow. But not this one. Not yet. The image jittered as Frank adjusted focus. The world was upside down, sky below, earth above. But he had practiced this. His brain could read it now. What mattered was position. And the Panther was drifting broadside, showing its weaker flank. "Stand by," he said quietly. Sam's foot hovered over the trigger. Tiny's breath hitched. The smell of fuel and sweat filled the cabin. Then the Panther paused, turret turning, cannon aligning. It had heard something. "Now," Frank said. The Sherman fired. The blast shook the earth. The recoil punched through the hull like thunder. The first round ripped through the hedgerow and struck the Panther's side plate near the road wheel. Sparks, a groan of metal, then silence. "Reload!" Tiny slammed another round into the breech. The next shot followed before the sound of the first had faded. The second impact hit true, just below the turret ring. A flash, a belch of flame, then a sharp crack as ammunition cooked off inside. The Panther jerked once, then stopped. Smoke poured from its hatches. Inside Ghostbaker, no one moved. The world had gone strangely quiet. Just the ringing in their ears, the faint hiss of burning fuel. Frank stared through the periscope, his hands trembling against the cold steel. Through the fractured lens, the enemy tank looked like a phantom dissolving in fire. It had happened. The impossible. The monster that stalked them was gone. Undone not by power, but by perspective. Sam whispered, "Jesus." "We did it." Frank didn't answer. He kept watching, waiting for movement. But there was none. Only a broken machine smoldering in the fog. A low laugh escaped Tiny. Nervous, disbelieving. Guess your crazy glass trick works after all. Frank exhaled slowly. Guess so. He looked down at the periscope. The mount was cracked from the vibration. The image flickered with smoke. It didn't matter. It had done its job. Outside, the sound of fire crackled through the mist. The crew sat motionless, stunned into stillness by what they'd just survived. Somewhere beyond the trees, artillery began again. Distant thunder rolling over Normandy. But for a brief, fragile moment, inside that steel box, everything was still. Frank rested his hand on the periscope, whispering more to himself than the others. It's not about seeing clearer. It's about seeing first. The words hung in the air like a truth too simple to ignore. Above them, the first light of dawn broke through the smoke and revealed the wreck of the Panther, burning quietly in the orchard. It was over, for now. The blast faded into the distance, replaced by a strange, fragile quiet. Only the Panther's engine still made a sound, a hollow metallic hiss. Then nothing. The air filled with the smell of burning oil and hot steel. Inside Ghost Baker, the crew sat frozen in disbelief. The light from the periscope cast faint orange reflections on their faces, each man trying to comprehend what had just happened. Tiny was the first to speak, his voice trembling. Did we just kill a panther?" Frank didn't look up. His eyes stayed fixed on the inverted, smoke-filled image in the periscope. "Yeah," he said quietly. "We did." For a long moment, none of them spoke. In Normandy, victories didn't feel like triumph. They felt like relief. Then the adrenaline hit. Joe, the driver, laughed. Half hysteria, half release. Sam let out a single sharp exhale, the kind that comes after realizing you're still alive. Tiny leaned back, helmet clattering against the hull. Frank finally turned from the scope. "Reload, just in case." "Sir, that thing's not moving," Sam said. Frank's voice stayed calm. "It was moving 5 minutes ago." "Reload," Tiny obeyed. The loader slid another armor-piercing round into the breech with trembling hands. The faint click of metal on metal sounded almost ceremonial, a prayer of caution. Through the periscope, the wreck of the Panther was beginning to settle. The turret sagged slightly. The flames inside were dimming. Then Frank saw it, a shape behind the first Panther, half hidden under branches, still silent. "Another one." "Hold," he whispered. The second Panther wasn't advancing. Its crew must have seen the explosion and decided this road was death. They had reversed out of the kill zone, leaving their fallen behind. The hunter had become the hunted and fled. Frank lowered the periscope slowly, his fingers smudged with soot. He looked around at his men. Their faces were dirty, sweat-streaked, and wide-eyed, but alive. Outside, dawn was bleeding through the mist. The battlefield that had once been a nightmare was now eerily peaceful. "Guess that thing of yours works," Joe said softly, trying to smile. Frank managed a tired grin. "Guess so." Tiny leaned against the ammo rack. "You realize, Lieutenant, nobody's ever going to believe this." "Then it's a good thing we're still around to tell them." They sat for another few minutes, listening to the crackle of the wreck. The smell of burning fuel seeped through the vents, sharp, chemical, unforgettable. Then the radio crackled to life. Headquarters calling for position reports. Frank picked up the handset, answered in calm, clipped tones. "Enemy armor destroyed. Coordinates confirmed. No casualties," a pause, then static. Then, "Say again, Ghost Baker. Confirm Panther destroyed?" Frank hesitated. The word felt impossible to say out loud. "Confirmed," he replied. "One Panther knocked out. Ghost Baker still operational." When they finally rolled out from behind the hedgerow an hour later, the field looked surreal. Smoke hung in lazy ribbons. The Panther's hull was blackened and silent, its gun still pointed at nothing. A reconnaissance jeep arrived soon after. Two officers climbed out, surveying the wreck with disbelief. One of them crouched beside the Panther's flank, tracing the jagged hole where the shell had punched through. 75 millimeter? He muttered. At that range? Frank stood beside him, silent. The other officer turned to him. How the hell did you get the first shot? Frank didn't answer right away. He glanced back at Ghost Baker, at the periscope jutting from the commander's hatch, cracked, blackened, and absurd-looking. He walked to the tank, unbolted the device, and set it on the hood of the Jeep. This, he said simply. The officers stared. One of them laughed, thinking it was a joke. The other just shook his head, muttering something about crazy mechanics. But when they looked again at the wreck of the Panther, the laughter stopped. Word spread fast. By noon, nearby units were talking about the Sherman that killed a Panther using a homemade scope. Some said it was luck. Others said it was impossible. But for the men who had seen it, and the 5 who had lived it, it was proof that ingenuity could do what armor couldn't. That night, Frank and his crew camped near the road, their tank parked beside the scorched wreck. They didn't celebrate. They just sat in silence, watching the embers fade. Tiny finally broke the quiet. You know, Lieutenant, he said, they called you crazy. Turns out crazy's not so bad, Frank smirked. Crazy's just another word for trying something first. Above them, the sky was clear for the first time in weeks. The guns were still echoing somewhere far off. But here, in this one small patch of France, 5 men had proved that even the smallest act of imagination could bend the course of a battle. The next morning, they would move again. Another town, another mission, another field. The periscope would be replaced, rebuilt, reimagined. The war would go on. But history had already turned its quiet page. Because in that single dawn, against the odds, a joke had become a weapon. And a man who refused to follow the manual had shown that vision, not firepower, wins wars. By noon, the word had already spread through the armored battalions like a rumor that refused to die. A Sherman had taken down a Panther, alone, in daylight, without air support. Some dismissed it as a fluke. Others swore they'd heard the radio confirmation themselves. But by evening, the story had a name: the Ghost Baker Incident. Headquarters wrote it off as a lucky shot. The official line read, "Enemy armor destroyed in defilade engagement by U.S. M4 utilizing concealed observation." Nothing more. No mention of a periscope. No mention of the man who built it. But among the tankers, the men who lived in that steel purgatory, stories traveled differently. They told it around campfires, in whispered disbelief between shellings. In the long nights when the rain hit the hull like typewriter keys, they spoke of Lieutenant Frank Daws, the soft-spoken officer with the upside-down scope, who had seen a panther before it saw him. They spoke of the silence before the shot, the flash, the miracle of survival. At first, few believed it. Then came the photographs. A reconnaissance unit had taken pictures that morning. The Panther, blackened and still smoking, Ghost Baker, mud-caked but intact, its barrel blackened from firing. The image spread through the ranks, printed in makeshift newsletters and posted on mess hall walls. For the first time, tankers had proof that the impossible could be done. It wasn't just the kill that mattered. It was the idea behind it. A soldier had disobeyed convention, trusted his hands and mind, and lived. In a war ruled by regulations and standard issue, that meant everything. By early August, several units in the 2nd and 3rd Armored Divisions began experimenting with similar field modifications. Mechanics scavenged optics from wrecked vehicles, fitting them into crude mounts welded to hatches. Some used mirrors, some used pipes. None looked pretty, but they worked, well enough to give the crews what they needed most: a few seconds warning. Those few seconds were often the difference between burning and breathing. reports began surfacing of other Shermans spotting ambushes before they were hit. Engineers back at ordnance depots took notice. The first sketches for elevated observation devices appeared in late August, an echo of Frank's field-born idea, now quietly making its way into official paperwork. The German commanders, meanwhile, began noting something unnerving. Patrol reports described Allied armor engaging from unseen positions and American tanks exhibiting increased sighting capability. They assumed new equipment, perhaps supplied from Britain. They never realized it came from a handful of soldiers, some scrap metal and a cracked lens. Among Allied crews, the story changed something deeper than tactics. It changed morale. Up to that point, the Panther had been a symbol of inevitability, the apex predator of the battlefield. To destroy one was like slaying a legend. Now, that legend had a scar. Frank Daws didn't brag about it. He barely spoke of it. When questioned by a superior about how he'd sighted the target, he simply said, "We saw it first." But his crew knew better. They'd been inside that tank. They'd seen him at work. They'd felt the calm in his voice, the unshakable belief that this strange little contraption could tilt the balance of life and death. To them, it wasn't luck. It was clarity. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. The same device that had been laughed at in training yards was now whispered about as a lifesaver. In letters home, men mentioned it like folklore. Some lieutenant rigged his Sherman with a backward scope and killed a panther. Maybe we'll all try it. In the chaos of Normandy's breakout, no one had time for ceremonies or medals. But among the crews, respect replaced ridicule. Mechanics began greeting Frank with a nod. Other commanders came by to ask how he'd done it. He showed them what he could, explaining the reversed prism, the improvised mounts, the trick of training your brain to see an upside-down image as normal. Most left shaking their heads, half admiring, half bewildered. Still, one thing had changed permanently. The laughter was gone. In the fields of France, amid the wreckage of tanks and smoke of victory, a quiet truth had taken root, that in war, imagination was as vital as courage. And the man with the upside-down periscope had just proved it. In the days that followed, the front moved east. The fields around Saint-Fromont were left behind, and with them, the burned husk of the panther that had once seemed invincible. But the story of Ghost Baker refused to fade. It followed the men, whispered, retold, reshaped, carried from one armored company to another, like a secret of survival. By the time the Allied lines reached Avranches, mechanics were already experimenting. Some mounted longer periscope tubes on their turrets. Others rigged mirrored sights from wrecked German vehicles. In field depots, engineers began sketching what they called extended observation fixtures, crude but functional prototypes inspired by the same principle Frank Daws had tested with his bare hands. None of these men knew his name. They just knew that somewhere in the hedgerows, a Sherman had seen a panther first and lived. That small idea began to ripple outward. It fit perfectly into the culture that was defining the American war machine: improvisation. The Americans didn't always have the best tanks, but they had the best mechanics. They didn't always have superior armor, but they had imagination. From the Cullen hedgerow cutters, welded from scrap steel and truck axles, to field-modified sandbag armor and camouflage nets, the front lines became a factory of ideas. Each small invention was born the same way, out of frustration, necessity, and the stubborn refusal to die quietly. When Allied forces broke out of Normandy in Operation Cobra, that mindset became doctrine. Tank crews who had once been cautious now advanced with confidence. They began choosing ambush positions rather than avoiding them, using the terrain instead of fighting against it. A subtle shift had occurred in the psychology of the armored corps. The Panther was no longer untouchable. reports began to filter up the chain of command. Isolated accounts of Sherman's taking down heavier tanks, using patience, teamwork, and visibility rather than brute force. In every one of those reports was the echo of Frank Dawes's idea, the belief that to survive, you had to see differently. But as with so many wartime innovations, there was no medal, no citation, no mention in the official records. The Army was slow to reward disobedience, even when it saved lives. Frank Dawes's Periscope was filed away as an unverified field adaptation. Still, its influence lingered. When the war ended in 1945, Allied engineers studied countless field improvisations, including Dawes's inverted periscope concept. The principle of indirect observation would soon become standard in the next generation of tanks. Rotatable commanders' cupolas, panoramic sights, elevated periscope heads. The technology evolved, but the heart of it, the spark that had ignited in a muddy field in Normandy, remained the same. Years later, military historians would describe the Normandy campaign as the birthplace of adaptive warfare. The idea that creativity, not conformity, wins battles. That innovation in the field could rival innovation in the factory. Frank Daws never claimed to invent anything. He just refused to stop thinking. For him, the periscope was never about glory. It was about 5 men in a tank who wanted to make it home alive. About fear turned into focus. About finding a way to look at the battlefield and life from a different angle. When the war finally ended, Ghost Baker's crew went their separate ways. Joe went back to Oklahoma. Tiny became a truck driver. Doc returned to teaching. Frank went home to Ohio and opened a small repair shop. The periscope, cracked, blackened, and dented, sat on a shelf in his garage for decades, gathering dust beside a stack of old wrenches and photographs. He rarely spoke about it, but those who did know him said that sometimes, when visitors asked about the war, he'd look up from his workbench, smile faintly, and say, "It's not about killing the monster. It's about learning to see it first." The war changed the world. His idea changed 5 lives. And that, perhaps, was enough. Because in the grand machinery of history, few things last forever. But vision, once found, never truly disappears. The fields of Normandy are quiet now. The hedgerows still grow thick, the air still heavy with summer mist. But beneath that silence lies the echo of an upside-down periscope. And the proof that even in humanity's darkest hour, one man's way of seeing differently could light the path through fear. War has a way of burying the small stories beneath the loud ones. The headlines remember the generals, the strategies, the great turning points, but not the quiet acts of defiance that kept men alive one day longer. The tale of Lieutenant Frank Daws and his upside-down periscope isn't about technology. It's about perspective, about the courage to question what everyone else accepts as truth. In July 1944, the Sherman was never meant to win against a Panther. On paper, it couldn't. Yet, in a corner of France, one man proved that innovation can level any battlefield. That thinking differently is a form of armor all its own. Every war produces its share of inventions. Radar, jet engines, code-breaking machines. But the ones that truly matter are often born not in laboratories, but in fear, in mud, and in necessity. They come from men who refuse to stop asking, "What if?" Frank Daws didn't build a better weapon. He built a better way to see. And through that lens, cracked, inverted, and imperfect, he glimpsed something larger than victory. He saw that survival belongs not to the strongest or the bravest, but to those who dare to reimagine the possible, even when everyone around them laughs. That's what makes his story timeless. Because long after the tanks have rusted, long after the fields of Normandy have gone green again, the lesson remains. Innovation doesn't wait for permission. It begins wherever a person looks at the world, turns it upside down, and finds clarity in the chaos. The battlefield changes, but the principle endures. In every engineer's sketch, every soldier's improvisation, every act of quiet courage that challenges convention. Frank Daws didn't rewrite history. He simply reminded it that vision, not power, decides who survives the storm, and that sometimes the clearest view of the world comes through a lens turned the wrong way up.